So in this chapter, we want to deal with Wheelock 6 on sum, to be, possum, to be able, and complementary infinitives. So, in chapter 4, we were introduced to the present forms of sum or essay, to be. In chapter 5, we learned the future and imperfect tenses for other verbs. And so now in chapter 6, we learn the forms of sum, essay, in these new tenses. You already learned it in the present, now we'll learn them in the future and imperfect tenses. But first, we do need to ask a question using a Shakespeare reference. What is the most famous line in the play Hamlet? To be or not to be? That is the question. And when it comes to the future and imperfect of the verb to be in Latin, the answer is not be. And that will make some sense here as we get started on the forms. So let's look at the forms of the future and imperfect indicative of sum and essay. Now here is the good news. You do not have to memorize the future or the imperfect of sum. Future would be things like I will be, you will be. Imperfect, I was, you were. You don't have to learn the paradigms of sum in these tenses if you can remember these crucial two things. Number one, that both of the tenses use the verb stem er. And secondly, both tenses use the future and imperfect tense signs or tense morphemes plus personal endings, but without the be. Okay, so when Hamlet asks is to be or not to be, the answer is not to be. All right, so let's look at a couple of examples here to illustrate this. I have the future tense of laudo, moneo, and sum, and the imperfect forms of those verbs as well. So for the future, I have the second singular form of laudo, laudabis, you will praise, of moneo, monebis, you will warn. And then for sum, notice it's eris, not erbis, as we had here, bis. It's not erbis. This be is not to be, all right? And so I do get the I of be, but not the be of be. Okay, so my tense sign or tense morpheme is be, but with ero, the be drops out. Okay, now with laudo in the imperfect, I have laudabas, you were praising, monebas, you were warning, again using second singular forms here. But for sum, it's not erbas, right? I am using for my stem, but not the ba. The be is not to be here. So instead of erbas, I get eras, you were. All right. So let's look at the whole paradigm now. And again, I don't require you to memorize this if you can remember those two things. We're going to see and then instead of be and ba, we just get e or a. Okay, for my tense sign or tense morpheme, and then I get the personal endings. Okay, so let's read these. Ero, so I will or shall be. Eris, you will be. Erit, he, she, or it will be. And remember, it can also mean there will be as an existential statement if it's third singular or plural. Eremus, we will or shall be. Eritis, you or y'all will be. And erunt, that would be they will be, or it could be there will be as in an existential statement. Okay, so don't forget that. So here we'll just make a note here that these can mean there will be. All right, and then on the imperfect side, eram, I was. Now you don't want to translate this as I was being, just I was. Remember, in the imperfect tense, using the progressive form with certain verbs that are stative in meaning become awkward in English. So don't translate this as I was being, just I was. Eras, you were. Erat, he, she, or it was. And we could also translate this as there were, right? It could be existential as well. Eramos, we were. Eratis, you were. And then errant, they were, or again, there were. Okay? So they were or there were. All right, now, one more little mnemonic device. To say that it was the end of an era means that the time is past. The time was, or the times were. And notice then that all forms of the imperfect have the letters era, right? Eram, eras, era. So when the era is over, it's done, it's past. Okay, so maybe that'll help. Point number 2. We come to the present, future, and imperfect active forms of possum and its infinitive posse, to be able, can, and here I have a little picture with a caption on it to help you remember that the possum posse can. The possum posse can. Those are the first 2 principal parts. Patui is the 3rd principal part. And this verb has 3 principal parts. Okay, so if you can remember the possum posse can, you can remember that this verb means to be able to, or can. Now, how do we form the forms of to be able in Latin? This is actually very easy once we have the forms of sum, esse under our belts, because the verb to be able is simply a compound verb that uses 2 parts, right? A compound is a joining of 2 things. We are adding pot as a prefix to all the forms of sum in the tenses that we've learned, the present, the future, and the imperfect. So don't get any crazy ideas. This is the only thing we're adding pot to, is the verb. No cannabis here. Now, there's one caveat here with adding pot to the beginning of forms of sum, and that is that when the pot prefix is followed by an s, the final t of pot assimilates. Assimilates means becomes like. So this t assimilates and becomes an s itself. So pot followed by s, sum, the t assimilates and basically becomes a copy of what it has following. Potsum then becomes possum. I can, I am able. Pot sumus, the t assimilates, becomes a copy of the s that follows. I get possumus, and then that's we can. But notice that when I add estus to pot, there's no s following, so that the t gets to stay, which is what I want to see. So you should expect t for pot in all situations unless that t is followed by an s and has to assimilate. So pot estus becomes potestus. Okay? In other words, it doesn't become anything different. Does that make sense? I hope so. All right. So let's just remind ourselves here something from the lesson and the chapter. These are the 3 principal parts: possum, posse, patui. And notice here that the infinitive posse is a contracted form of what we would have expected, right? The infinitive of sum is esse. If I'm adding pot to all the forms of sum, including the infinitive, I should get pot esse. What seems to have happened is contraction, where the e probably fell out first, and then the t followed by the s assimilates, and I'm left with posse. All right? So here are the forms of possum in the 3 tenses. In the present, this is going to mean I, you, he, she, it, am able, can. Future, I, you, she, it, will be able, and imperfect, I was able. Or you could translate as I could, not as in ability, not as in something like I could really use a drink, where it expresses desire, but rather where it expresses ability in the past. When he was young, he could eat 30 hot dogs in one sitting, something like that. Okay, so let us read the forms here, and you can repeat after me as we go. Possum, potes, potest, possumus, potestis, possunt. All right, future. Potero, poteris, poterit, poterimus, poteritis, poterunt. And then the imperfect. Poteram, poteras, poterat, poteramus, poteratis, poterant. All right. Remember, our endings here are all the same as what we learned with our mnemonic device. Most, must, isn't it so? Okay. All right. Last thing. Point number 3, complementary infinitives. Please note the spelling of complementary. It's spelled with an E. That makes this different from the word complementary, where you have an I spelled this way. These mean very different things. Complementary means that you are praising someone, right? Complementary has to do with completing, and that's what we get to here. The infinitive, which we're learning as the second principal part of our verbs when we learn a new verb, the infinitive is used with verbs whose meaning requires an infinitive to complete its meaning. So the word complementary simply means completing. It comes from a Latin verb that means to complete. So I have expressions in English, to have to or must, and this sort of a verb requires an infinitive to go with it. If I say something like Johnny must, and then I stop, you feel like I'm missing something crucial to the meaning of that verb. You would ask, must what? Or if I say Johnny has to, and then stop, you will then ask, has to what? And you're expecting an infinitive to follow. That's the nature of the semantics of a verb like that. Verbs like to be able or can, these also take a complementary infinitive. If I say John is able, but then stop, you want to say able to what? So these are examples of verbs that we now know that require a complementary infinitive to complete or fill out its meaning. So, debao, we learned that with my infinitive now, and possum with my infinitive. Notice the infinitive, it goes with these verbs here. So, debao as a first singular form, I must praise. I have to praise. I ought to praise. Possum laudare, I can praise. I am able to praise. Now, as we go on, we're going to meet other verbs that take complementary infinitives given their semantics, given their meaning. Audeo is one example. To dare. So you could imagine somebody saying, he dared to do something, and there will be a complementary infinitive following. And other verbs will take complementary infinitives, and we'll learn those as we come to them. Now, one thing about positioning, the complementary infinitive may come before or after the main verb that it depends on. So I'm not going to give you all the examples in the textbook of using a complementary infinitive. I'm just going to use one of the examples. I'm going to show you how the infinitive can go in either position. So both of these sentences mean the same thing. My friend is not able to remain. Amicus meus non potest remanere. All right? So notice that the infinitive is here. The main verb is potest, to be able, in the present tense. My friend not is able to remain. So here the infinitive follows. But in my second example, the infinitive is before the main verb. Amicus meus remanere non potest. Okay, so my friend to remain is not able in Latin order, but I would translate these the same way. So just be on the lookout. In English, we like to put our infinitive after the main verb. In Latin, you could see it in either place, so don't get lost, okay? When you find a verb whose meaning seems to require an infinitive to complement it, to fill out its meaning, then make sure that you translate these things together, okay? All right, good.